We never stop being colonies economically. In the previous episode of Let's Reason, we spoke about the need for a global Pan African revolutionary movement to drive the economical manufacturing development of Africa and also the social and economic evolution of Africa. So during colonization, African and Caribbean territories were used for the access of cheap labor, cheap raw materials to provide to the colonizer. But it was more than that. Colonies, what we know is that colonies could not manufacture their own goods. They couldn't make their own trade policies. They could not manufacture goods that is needed for their population. Indigenous means of production were mostly outlawed. They were undermined. Export of raw materials were controlled by these imperialist countries, the occupying force. An example of that is Jamaica in the Caribbean was a big exporter of sugar or sugar syrup. And Ghana in West Africa was a huge producer and also exported cocoa beans. Both Jamaica and Ghana exported sugar, cocoa beans to Britain. And in Britain, in London to be specific, that cocoa bean and that sugar would pair together to create a chocolate bar or some Nestle product as we call it Milo in the Caribbean, in Ghana, in West Africa, they would call things like Milo. These products will then be sold throughout Europe, of course, throughout the world, but they will send back these finished goods will be sent back to the colonies, to the islands, to the territories in Africa to be sold at a profit by the industrialists in Europe and with other materials in the Americas. So when we look at flag independence, what has changed since then? Yes, we are allowed to have our own political leaders. Well, have our own political leaders. These leaders come into power. But the root and the economies of these countries have not changed. We're still today, Ghana is still supplying cocoa beans, of course, other materials, raw materials to Western economies and Western industries. And the same thing is happening. Jamaica is still producing sugar, other raw materials to these big industrial nations. So therefore, this is why we say our countries had never stopped being colonies. During colonization, it was not just about accessing to raw materials and cheap labors and so forth. It was also access to market. So the whole thing was they would produce a good and they need somewhere to sell that good, that 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 those goods to make to make huge profits. Another example of us being still being a colony is our education system. Our education system is not fixed to fit the need of our country. It's not fit to solve the problem of our country. It is fit to solve the demand of labor and whatsoever in these developing nations. So from the Caribbean, you have a lot of teachers being exported to different nations like Canada, the US, and even the UK. nurses from Africa, doctors from Africa are going to these big countries. So you can see the same economic model are still being used in this time. So as in the past, where products were basically imposed and indigenous people, these did not solve the problem of our people. As we see today, we don't manufacture the product that we'll need to solve our problem. Cars are not manufactured to fit the environment, to fit the social economic situation of most countries in the global south, in Africa, in the Caribbean and so forth. And if we go further and look at the agricultural sphere, Africa can feed itself easily. Africa can feed the world. Africa has more than 65% of the world's arable land, which means untapped farmland. But still, we see Africa struggle to feed itself. This is very deliberate because these industrial, you know, these industrial nations has huge farming industry and they need somewhere to dump their subsidized farming products. So farmers in the US or in Canada, in Europe are benefited at the expense of farmers in Africa or in the Caribbean. And to go even further with that, the farming product is not necessarily good or it's not necessarily the diet for people in the Caribbean or people in Africa. People the food in the food in the global south is not necessarily the same food that others will eat in 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 the north, in the global north. And this can destroy local agricultural producers, local farmers, and so forth. So these policies that result these policies of that result in the lack of agriculture production in Africa is very deliberate. It is the same continuation of the colonial economic policies used in the past by those imperialist power. So during the 1600, the European came up with this system of trade, this economic system. It's called the mercantile system, where nations would maximize their exports, minimize their imports, and call that a balance of trade. I don't know how that is balanced when one is more than the other, but that was the economic model of the European empire, the European nation. And oh, did a lot of them achieve that? Of course, their products was forced on these colonies. So these colonies weren't allowed to import. They weren't allowed to import technology. There was no technology transfer as what we see today. Goods were not the goods they import were being forced upon them was it did not tailor to their need. So that's why a lot of us we develop taste for Western products like alcohol. Indigenous alcohol were outlawed. Indigenous alcohol were considered to be primitive. So let's get the Western brand, the Western version of alcohol. And these alcohol were being produced somewhere else. For example, a certain rum might be produced in the Caribbean from sugar cane, shipped to England, and then shipped to the colonies in Africa, where it is sold to locals. And to push that, the British came up with the Navigation Act during their colonial reign, which basically said that no colonies, no one could import into a British colony without using, for example, a British ship or through British companies. So you can see what they were doing, these empires, these colonial empires. Colonialism wasn't just to change our names, wasn't just to change our religion, change our lives in that way. And even the changing of names and religion, the way we dress, was still a part of this system to create a market. Indigenous clothes were shunned for Western clothes. Cottons, cotton that is produced in let's say Upper Volta or Burkina Faso is then shipped to Europe, turned into textile, and then clothes were sent back to their colonies, as we see in the Americas. The Americas was North America was big for cotton. So, ladies and gentlemen, this episode of Less Reason, we're putting forward that economic colonization was the most difficult thing to overcome, because when our countries receive independence, the economic system still remained. So to use Ghana as an example, Ghana was a big support supplier of cocoa. So when Ghana became independent, that was the primary export of Ghana, gold and so forth, to supply to these companies. And we had these multinationals that still remain in these countries. So they had huge influence over the economy of these newly independent state or semi-independent state. So the economic side of things is where the challenge has remained. Um, we recognize the need to unify Africa, not just politically. We always talk about political unity, but the unity need to go economically. It need to become basically a federal system. This is what we need in Africa, where the economy is combined, of course, but still, we know we live in a predatory world, so we have to be able to defend ourselves, to negotiate with these massive economies and massive countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the second episode of Let's Reason. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a nice week.